All right, hello, good morning. We're gonna get this video started with a dad joke. What do you call a fake noodle? An impasta. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's pick up with where we left our Freytag pyramid. So we are going to start drafting in a Google Doc. So before you get too far into this, I want you to make sure that you have a Google Doc open, just like I do right here, and title it so you don't lose it. Title it your first and last name, nonfiction narrative essay. So I'll give you a second to do that. And make sure you have your Freytag pyramid worksheet in front of you. I'm working on mine online. Obviously, yours is on paper. So make sure you have that before we get started. I am going to just start by copying and pasting my bullet points that I wrote onto my Google Doc. Obviously for you, if you wrote it out, you're going to have to type what you wrote. Actually, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to label each bullet point as the part of the Freytag pyramid. So for example, this first part is the exposition. So I'm going to type exposition, and then for the bullet point that's the exposition, I'm going to click this button up here, and that's going to increase the indent. So that way this I know is part of the exposition. And then after that, this is the rising action for my Freytag pyramid. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to move these bullet points this way, and that way I can just keep it organized in the same order as my Freytag pyramid. So then after the rising action, there's the climax. So obviously for you, you're going to be typing this. All right, so now that I have everything on a Google Doc, I'm going to add a couple of things, and you should type this in your Google Doc as well. So an exposition, if you remember, includes what two things? That's right, it includes the setting and the characters. So I'm going to include in my bullet points here setting and characters. And I'm not too stressed about adding to it yet, but I'm just going to keep that there so I remember that I have to include this in my exposition. I have to explain where the story is taking place and the people who are involved in the story. And then in the rising action, if you remember from plot structure, there's something known as the inciting incident or the inciting event that begins the rising action, and that introduces the conflict. So what introduces the conflict? What's really the first, glimmer of the conflict that's going to come? So that's important in your rising action, so I would note that here. And then for the climax, a climax by definition is a turning point. So I would write here underneath climax turning point, and then what changes? Because that's really what you want the climax to be. What is changing here? What is the reader expecting, and how are we turning on those expectations? So I'm going to include that in climax. The falling action, this is kind of like moving into the resolution. We can leave that as it is. And the resolution, I'm going to include theme here. What did I learn? So just to recap, I'm going to put these in bold. These are the things that you should add to your outline right now. So take a second, and in your Google Doc, make sure you have exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution in bullet points like this. And then the words that I just bolded, I want you to add to your Google Doc as well, because this is going to be the same for all essays. All narrative essays should include these elements. So I'll give you a second to go ahead and do that. All right, so now I'm going to start thinking about what I'm going to add for my essay. So the setting is in Seoul, South Korea for my personal story. I had just moved there, so I'm going to include that. I had 2 weeks of quarantine. This might be relevant for the beginning of the story before starting my first kindergarten teaching job. So go ahead and add something to the setting. What's important for your readers to know about this setting? Maybe you're talking about a sports injury. Well, maybe talk about your coach, talk about tryouts, talk about where you were playing this. Give some of that background that would be helpful for your reader to know about the setting. And then characters. Obviously, it's a little weird to call people characters because they're people in your real life. But go ahead and take a second and think about all of the characters, all the people who are going to be important to this story. So for me, that was my coworkers, other teachers at the school, my boss at the time, let's call her Rebecca, and of course, my kindergarten students and my students' parents. So these are all people that are going to be important in the story. So that's why I'm listing them here. So inciting event, what starts the conflict? What is the first kind of glimmer of a problem that happens? For me, looking back, and again, you're providing a narrative to something that happened in real life. There might not be a moment that you can think of and say, oh, that's when I knew I was about to break my leg, or that's when I knew that things were about to go horribly wrong. If you can't think of when an inciting event would have been, you can either make it up or you can try to think of when you started to predict that there was a problem. So if you can remember that, great. If not, you can kind of infer based on what happened afterwards. So I would say that probably the first time I knew that there was going to be some conflict with teaching kindergarten was when one of my students ran back to class before the rest of us and locked herself in the classroom and barricaded the door. So I'm going to say that's the inciting event. So take a second, add your own inciting event. When was the first time in this story that you glimpsed a conflict about to happen? And then I want to add a little more to the rising action. The rising action should really be the longest part. A lot of people put the climax in the middle of the story, and most of the time that's not true. Most of the time the climax is at the very end or right before the end, at least over like 3/4 of the way through the story. So most of pretty much any narrative is building up to that. So what were some of the other problems that occurred after this? She would hit other kids with her water bottle and make them cry. There were a lot of tears in general. Let's see, what else? Every time I asked students to write, they would cry. They wanted to eat food off the floor. What else? It's the constant fights. Refusing to repeat anything in English. All right, so then we get to the climax and we get to the turning point. I think, though, to talk about the turning point, it is important to build up to it. So the turning point, I would say, is when Lila, this student, the name that I'm giving this student, did her speech perfectly on the night of the parent night, and she talked about Van Gogh. And it's important to kind of work towards that. So I would say there were some ways that we kind of built a relationship. So I was able to kind of like find fun ways to incentivize her speaking in English. All right. And then the parent night, she gave her speech on Van Gogh. She talked about the painting Irises. I believe that was the one she did. Yeah. So every student chose a different Van Gogh painting to give their speech on, and she talked about irises. She did a great job. The school was super crowded. This is a detail I'm going to include, and lots of pictures. So include as many details as you can think of in your outline. All right, so following action, Lila started getting along better with others and listening to me after a couple months together. She had a great sense of humor, and I'm going to include that, which I started to see more the longer I was her teacher. And then the theme. Okay, so what did I learn? I didn't really add what I learned in this part of the resolution, so I'm going to add this here. So take a second and look at your resolution and think about the theme that you want to communicate to your readers. What did you learn through this obstacle that you overcame? So for me, I think something I learned is building relationships takes time and effort and a lot of patience, especially with kindergartners. The way that I wrote that wasn't super pretty, to be honest, but that's okay because this is an outline. So just take a minute and think about what you learned from this obstacle and just put your ideas on paper. All right, so I feel like this is a pretty good start to an outline. I can definitely see as I expand this that it will be probably about 1.5 to 2 pages, which is what I'm expecting from you. So take a minute and add as many details as you can. Here are the non-negotiables. Your outline isn't going to look exactly like mine, and that is a-okay. What I'm looking for is make sure that you have each part of the plot structure that we talked about. You don't have to highlight it. I'm just showing you this to highlight the parts that I want to see from you. So in your outline, I want to see that you have it organized by exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. And I also want to see these parts in bold. So I want to see that you wrote the setting and you brainstormed it. I want to see that you wrote the characters and you brainstormed who the people are going to be in this story. I want to see the inciting event. What's the thing that kind of introduces the conflict? And in the climax, what's the turning point? What changes? And I want to see a theme, especially in the resolution. So again, these do not have to be in full sentences. You don't have to have a bazillion bullet points like I did, but I would put as many details as you can remember off the top of your head in this outline, because then you'll be able to expand those into full sentences later. So just a reminder that this outline is due 3 p.m. on Friday in Schoology on the Google Docs assignment. So if you started typing this in a Google Doc, don't forget you can just copy and paste it into the outline assignment on Schoology. So make sure that you turn this in by Friday at 3 p.m. And then next week, you'll be all set to start expanding your bullet points into full sentences and editing and then submitting your narrative essay by the end of next week, Friday, October 3rd. Good luck. I can't wait to read what you write.